So, what are we going to talk about in this session? Three things really. Well, first of all, I'm just going to very briefly talk about what you might have seen when it comes to assessment reports for dyslexia. Very politely calling that the traditional approach. There are other adjectives I might use increasingly, but it is the traditional approach, and it might be what you have seen thus far. And then going to talk through some problems with that, some challenges, some issues that present from the way we've traditionally done things, and then go on to talk about what I've rather arrogantly called a better way of doing this sort of stuff. The genesis for this conversation was really, or for this presentation, was a conversation I had with Quiva and her colleague Leah about assessment reports, just trying to sort of demystify and trying to de-jargonize. That's not a word in itself, is jargon, but you know what I mean, trying to get rid of all the kind of psych speak. Everything from the title of these reports, for example, they're still often entitled psycho-educational reports and things like that, really unpleasant language. So we'll talk about language throughout, and we'll also talk a wee bit about theory and the research that's sort of informing my position, because it's not just my view on this, it's also evidence informed, if you like. It's also, I would say, quite about taking pragmatics and realpolitik into consideration, things like finance and timing and access. All these sorts of issues will cut across what we're talking about. Okay, so traditionally, when someone was being assessed for dyslexia, we had this, what was commonly known in the literature as a discrepancy approach, which is a wee bit of a technical approach, but basically it meant there was a lot of time and emphasis placed on IQ. So psychologists trained at college on how to do IQ assessments would sit down with a student or an adult who is in the workplace, and they would do a full IQ assessment on them. Now, curiously, the client coming did not ask for an IQ assessment, they asked for a dyslexia assessment, but yet they got a full IQ assessment, which took the guts of an hour and is quite intrusive. And, you know, there was a lot of time spent on it and also a lot of emphasis placed on it in the report, pages and pages explaining and what the scores meant and what the indexes meant and what the overall profile picture was. And essentially my contention is there was far too much emphasis on scores and psychometrics, lots of decimal points in reports, lots of complicated tables that psychologists understand, but essentially the psychologist was writing for as if the audience was their psychology professor rather than a dyslexic adult or a very busy disability officer or busy teacher or parent who might have dyslexia themselves. And there was not enough qualitative stuff in there. There was not enough history, and there was not enough, frankly, humanity about the individual, especially an adult sitting opposite you, who is telling you they had issues with reading and spelling or similar things. And our approach was almost a one size fits all. We'll do some IQ, and then we'll do some reading and spelling afterwards. And what that broadly looked like was, we've got two individuals here. So we've got person A on the left and person B on the right. And person A is almost your sort of traditional classic dyslexic profile. So 100 being average and 90 to 110 being the average range. This person had above average IQ, so they were very smart. And anyone that knew that person knew they were smart before they ever did an IQ test, but it was confirmed with an IQ score of 113. And then when they assess things like reading, or you could put spelling or writing in that category as well, they saw that there was a much lower score there. And traditionally, that discrepancy between this score and this score here, this gap or discrepancy, was what what psychologists would be looking for. And the bigger the gap, the more confident they would be that they are dyslexic. And this would also lead to some strange rules that you had to have an IQ over 90 to be dyslexic, for example. Now, person B on the right is an individual who has exactly the same reading and spelling and writing difficulties here, phonological difficulties. All the sort of pink stuff is exactly the same, but their IQ isn't particularly discrepant. It's not above 90. Now, traditionally, this person would not get a diagnosis. They would just be told that they were reading or working to their potential. Now, that's the problem with the discrepancy model in a nutshell. Both of these people are dyslexic, this person and this person. This person is more easily spotted because they might be more orally articulate, or they might be more frustrated, in a workplace, or they might be able to participate in discussions with great aplomb, but then their reading or writing or spelling is very poor. So it's more unexpected, more noticeable, and easier to kind of identify that this person is equally dyslexic, but traditionally they were told they weren't. I actually assessed somebody back in 2012 with this profile, and it was the last time that I allowed myself to say that they weren't dyslexic. And I said, we're going to have to do something about this because that person is dyslexic and the IQ is broadly irrelevant until it goes down very low to something like near 70. And at that point, you're talking about general learning difficulties, which are fairly obvious before you ever open an IQ assessment. Speaking to someone for a short period of time would tell you if someone's IQ is at that level. So that was a big problem methodologically, big problem ethically as well. So the problems with this approach is the other thing is, can a psychologist or EP, educational psychologist, really at such a remove from the workplace or the college, even could be that the young person, the student hasn't even started at college yet, can they really make appropriate recommendations for support? So it's working on the problem or accommodations to work around the problem. The psychologist doesn't know the course content, the assessment format, this kind of environment that student would be learning in, and they're probably even less likely to be aware of the organization, the role expectations, the job description, the industry, the IT that might be used, the software, the portals, the platforms, all of these things. And yet we were kind of expecting EPs to have crystal balls and say, these are all the types of things that this person needs. It really was a bit House of Cards or a little bit of Emperor's New Clothes, to be quite frank. And what it often did was it can set up unrealistic expectations. So I write in a report that someone needs a spelling and grammar waiver, but actually there's no exams on the course that this individual is doing, so the spelling is never assessed. So all of a sudden, an individual's walking in saying, "Where's my grammar?" And a disability officer or a course director or someone in HR might say, "Well, there's no exams. We don't look for that." So it sets up potential conflict as well in doing this. There's also an implication that accommodations are fixed. So a week after assessing an adult, I can write down accommodations that they will then need in every role forever, which is not true. Depending on the nature of the role, the nature of the course, accommodations need to be flexible, and it will depend on the individual. And also the same individual's dyslexia changes according to context or environment, or according to confidence, or according to days that are really challenging and weeks that are much harder than others because of stress or because of tiredness or because of deadlines. So accommodations have to be flexible to fit the individual and to fit the environment or context. However, I think that, but our colleges and workplaces, colleagues joining today, are we happy to proceed without this exhaustive list of recommendations? Even recently, I received a form from a government department asking me to set out all the accommodations to almost validate what might be put in place for an individual, rather than them just sitting down with the individual and chatting through those. So there is still this kind of need for the professional assessment, the objective recommendation. And objective is usually a good thing, isn't it? But actually, subjective is more appropriate here because the objective stuff can't do all the things that we think it might be able to do. So a better way. First of all, what should we be assessing if not sitting there for an hour doing IQ? Well, whatever we assess should be related to the theory of what dyslexia is. And dyslexia is broadly a difficulty with accuracy and fluency with written language, that's reading and spelling. So if you think about what we should assess first, it should obviously be things like to do with reading, so phonological awareness, reading of real words and non-words. Non-words are a great way to assess someone's sounding out ability. And there are really good, reliable tests for that. And that can be in lists, word lists, presented almost like you're at the opticians and you've got easy words down to hard words, or it could be paragraphs of text or in articles. And we're looking for accuracy of reading there. We can also look at speed of reading, because again, that's an aspect of what dyslexia is. And we can also look at comprehension, because although people with dyslexia don't have thinking problems, they don't have cognitive problems, but because accuracy and fluency of reading can be massively affected, it can interfere with comprehension. And we should also look at spelling and writing speed, because again, we know that these things are affected by dyslexia. And really important is to take a good history. And also included in that, those questions is what has helped in the past? Support at school, at college, previous roles. So did you respond to an intervention? Did an accommodation or a bit of support make things easier, make you achieve your potential more easily? And absolutely vital when assessing with adults. We also have a great ability to speak to them during the assessment, before the assessment, after the assessment, to get their own views, their perspectives and insights. We don't always have that luxury with young people, but we certainly have it with adults. And that's their own reality of the situation, and it's as valuable as any standardized test of any particular score. And what I would say about all of this stuff is we should assess this, and not one test by itself is meaningful. Building a 3D picture, taking the qualitative stuff as well as the scores, that gets you a nice rounded picture. And again, that takes a bit of time, and we can go really in depth around the stuff that matters rather than spending loads of time looking at overall IQ. Now, one thing we might look at that's not related to dyslexia is maybe look at people's vocabulary or their oral skills or listening skills. But at that point, we're looking for evidence that they are able to do things. But usually we do that just if there's a question mark about someone's overall cognitive profile. But we don't have to go and do a full IQ test to do that. So what should reports look like? Well, there's a phrase that I've used with colleagues before about doing things faster, cheaper, and shorter. And we evaluate every report that we ever send out to clients at Dyslexia Ireland. So they send a SurveyMonkey link with the report. And one of the questions we send that's included in the evaluation is, how was the report? Was it too long, too short, or just about right? Many people have said to me, well, I've never seen one before, so how am I supposed to know? It's a bit like if you got your first survey on your house, you don't know what a surveyor's report looks like. It could be 40 pages, it could be half a page. So, but certainly a few people have said they're too long, they're too complicated, they're too full of jargon, and they're very expensive. So what we decided was, could we do this better? And what I've got here is an exemplar report for you. So this is a real report that we've just taken the names out here. And this is a 4-page report. Okay, so we've obviously got some demographic information here at the top, and then we've got a bit of background information, little introduction, why they're coming, etc., and then a little bit of history here. That's one paragraph. We've gone from senior infants through to college there. Okay. Next bit of the report is talking about the difficulties. This part up here is talking about the difficulties they face to do with the course, etc., and then some more detail about what they're finding particularly difficult. But that is still on page 1. So we're about 2/3 of the way down page 1 here. And then a very generic paragraph basically saying, okay, this is to help navigate the report. The next bit of the report is going to take you to the assessment bit. We also, if we're doing it online, as we have been, we explain that we do it using online tools. And also here we say that we feel that the performance was a good representation because they persevered at tasks. We're then straight into results. Nothing about IQ. We go to talk about reading and writing, and then we move on to talk about other things that we know are connected to dyslexia, like working memory, little processing speed test. That test takes about a minute to administer. It's really important. And in this case, there is a verbal comprehension score, which comes from an IQ battery. And look, we can see that this person is very bright orally, but that test itself takes about 5 to 7 minutes to administer as well. And it's quite stark that this person is an intelligent, articulate, orally very able person, but these other scores, if you go back just for a second, some of them are very low. Okay, so her ability to sound out words is very low compared to maybe her ability to read words she's seen before. And that's a very common profile in adults with dyslexia. And then we're straight into summary and recommendations. This is about halfway down page 2. Sorry, and then I'm going to just linger on this for a second. We very quickly say what it is. We give a sense that it's in the moderate range because people kind of want to know, am I severely dyslexic? Am I mildly dyslexic? But you can see it's a lowercase m there on moderate. Okay, it's not some sort of subcategory. It's just trying to give a sense of how it's presenting. We then basically talk through in 2 paragraphs a little summary of what those scores mean. Okay, this bit really is about her persistence and her sort of psychological approach to being dyslexic. And then this here talks about the skills that reading, etc. And a short, focused summary. Then we're straight into accommodations. But as you can see here, they're quite generic, general types of accommodations. So we're talking about accommodations at third level. Here, this individual was planning to go and work for themselves, but we have highlighted that if she ever undertakes paid employment, then she needs to speak to her employer about accommodations. And we've got links where she can get more information if and when she needs to. And that's a hot link that takes people straight to the relevant page. We're also here a little bit about assistive technology, and we've got a link to our own YouTube channel where colleagues who work for Dyslexia Ireland have put together short videos demonstrating bits of kit, because some people don't know what you mean by speech to text, but when they see it, they get it very quickly. And then it is basically a platitude at the end saying thank you very much, and then sign off. That's page 3 of the report, or indeed, I think page 2 of the report still. And then we're a quick explanation of what the terms mean, trying to sort of demystify some of the jargon. We can't completely remove jargon from the report. And then a last page showing what tests were done and what those tests measure. And that's it. 4 pages of an assessment report. So it's definitely probably shorter than reports you may have seen. We charge €300 for this assessment, which is still a heck of a lot of money, but it's half of what most psychologists would charge for the same thing, often because they're doing unnecessary IQ testing, which is very skilled and very technical, but it's not what the client asked for, and it can be quite intrusive. And then there's also just that challenge of the amount of time. It's not faster, it's slower. It's not shorter, it's a much longer report, and it's certainly not cheaper. So more about this better way. Well, we basically less emphasis or indeed no emphasis placed on IQ. This allows us to do something quite revolutionary, or certainly small r radical. And in the past 3 to 4 years, Dyslexia Ireland has been delivering training on dyslexia assessment to colleagues in further education settings, going to, I think we've probably been to about 7 or 8 different ETBs around the country, and showing how you can do dyslexia assessment because you don't need IQ. Because often students in these settings where had no access either because of service delivery or because of financial barriers, they had no access to any type of dyslexia assessment. Also, it sometimes throws into light, well, wait a minute, if I've done a screener in HEI and I've then sent that client to Donald at Dyslexia Ireland, he's really not doing much extra or different in his, quote, full assessment. And that's true, because the screeners are actually really good. One of the things about a screener is the screener is a bit misleading. They're actually measuring often far more relevant things than a traditional psychological report would measure. So this kind of dichotomy between screening and a full assessment becomes a little bit redundant. Also, we're very keen at Dyslexia Ireland about giving the word away, because it's been reserved for particular types of people with particular qualifications after their name, like myself. And yet we know that there's not enough of us, and we charge a lot of money, and there's no way the state can provide for 10% of the population. So instead of us reserving it just to psychologists, maybe we could give it to skilled educationalists doing needs assessments, doing what might have been called screeners, or doing the type of things that we have demonstrated as possible to colleagues in FE settings. And it's quite funny, actually, when it was actually Quiva's predecessor with myself, Michelle Kinslow. Some of you might know Michelle. She works elsewhere now, but when we started doing this, it was a 2-day course. And I think the first course was in Cork, and we were doing in the training centre in Cork. And the first day, people were coming in a little bit skeptical. There was a few folded arms in the front row. Really? I don't know if this is going to be possible. But by about lunchtime, we started to see people relax. By home time on day 1, people were kind of going, we think we kind of believe that we can do this. Then the next day they'd come back, and maybe a few people had been on Google, and they kind of said, well, we've not found anything to say you're wrong. And by the end of the day, people were really pumped up by the end of the 2 days, because they were saying, if we can do this, this can transform some of our learners' experience that they would never have access to if they had to wait or pay for a professional psychological assessment. Also, this is the premise that it's educational needs that should unlock resources, not necessarily a diagnosis. And far from being perfect, the education system at primary and post-primary is very quickly moving towards that. that a diagnosis of autism or dyslexia is no longer required to access additional teaching support. So the system is moving towards this far more. But there are obviously some discrepancies in how that works at the moment. The other thing quickly to say about a psychologist as well is if your friend said to you over coffee one day that she was seeing a psychologist, your immediate reaction would probably be, "Oh my goodness, are you okay? What's going on?" So, we carry a bit of stigma, don't we, psychologists, and that's fine. But you shouldn't see a psychologist unless you absolutely need to. And in this case, reading, spelling, and writing, and the types of supports and accommodations, it is quite possible that that's not required. However, accurate assessment is still very important. I'll talk about the difference between assessment and diagnosis in a second, but it's important to know if you're dyslexic for your identity. It's important to know often for self-esteem, mental health, confidence. Finding out you're dyslexic isn't a label, it's a relabeling. It is turning a potential word like lazy, careless, horrible words like thick or not achieving your potential, or at school it might be you were bold or a messer. And all of a sudden you've got another word that is more accurate, and that's very important for psychological well-being. And finally, also, as a recognised disability internationally, and under EU and Irish law, gives you legal protection and gives you access to disability discrimination and equalities legislation. So it is still very important. The bit of paper, the formal kind of assessment is still important. What I'm suggesting is it doesn't necessarily have to be an educational psychologist that does it. Other final thoughts. A report is not the final word. It is only a snapshot. We work with clients for between 70 and 120 minutes. So that it doesn't tell you absolutely everything about the individual. And what we do at the moment for adults is, as well as giving them their full report, and as you can see, it's not particularly full, it's a short focus report. We also give them a very, very short letter, the kind of to whom it may concern letter, just confirming that name, Nameson came for an assessment on the 25th of November. The outcome of the assessment was that they were identified as being dyslexic, having a specific learning difficulty, end of, yours faithfully. And that allows individuals to give that letter to the disability liaison officer, or give that letter to the individual in the access and inclusion office at college, rather than the full report. And that's important as well. And in our regard, it's not the be all and end all, because we don't go into chapter and verse with the background. But sometimes some psychologists will write quite detailed background about quite personal stuff, about quite, things about school that is not necessarily amazing for an individual working in an office to pass to their boss or their HR colleague. So a short report confirming the diagnosis or the assessment can be seen as just sufficient. And that we get some mixed feedback on that, but a lot of people appreciate the option of having that short one-page PDF to share, rather than something that can be a bit more intrusive. Also, can't emphasize this enough, that if you are speaking to an individual who's just disclosed that they are dyslexic to you, it's really have that discussion, believe them, ask them what they need to think about, what we need to do here. It's the opposite of sending a form to a professional and saying, can you confirm this person is dyslexic? Which is almost like, prove to me that you need this help. And it's funny, dyslexia sometimes is quite unique, like other, well, it's not unique, it's like other hidden disabilities that have that uniqueness of almost prove to me that you are, as if there are people going about saying they're dyslexic just for a bit of a laugh, for a bit of a distraction. And it is that sort of burden of proof put on the dyslexic person time and time again. I did speak to an adult a couple of years ago who went to work for one of the big tech firms in Dublin, and she brought along her folder, plastic folder full to the brim of reports and evidence she got accommodations at school. In fact, she got extra time at college. She was all ready to say, okay, this was, I think, her first performance review, and she said, I was ready to tell my line manager that I was dyslexic. So told the line manager, and she said, oh, right, fine, my daughter's dyslexic. Oh, wow, okay, that's great. So what can we do for you? She said, well, not much, but there's a couple of things to be aware of. They had a really nice conversation. And she said, now, do you need all my paperwork? And the line manager said, no, I don't think so. Why? She said, well, usually I have to prove that what I've just told you is the truth. And she said, we're paying you 100,000 quid a year. We're trusting you with lots of important information. We're going to assume you're not making this up. And smiled, and that was the end of it. So there's a wee example of an approach where it's not always putting that burden of proof onto the individual, and it's having that positive conversation, and it's conversations. It's not a one-off, it has to be returned to. And just as a quick word to say, we talk about diagnosis and assessment and identification. Broadly, those mean the same thing. But diagnosis is sometimes not everyone's preference when it talks about, I have a diagnosis of dyslexia. Assessment can sound like a wee bit formal and a wee bit one-off. Identification is a bit friendlier, but it doesn't sound very formal. But what we found in the past is if we talk to people and say, would you be confident identifying reading and spelling difficulties? Most people in an education sort of role would say, yeah, I feel very confident. That's our job, especially if you're say a primary teacher or a support teacher at secondary school or an inclusion officer. But if you say, would you be confident diagnosing dyslexia, people get a bit nervous. So the language does carry value and weight. So broadly, I would say my preference these days is talk about identification and assessment rather than diagnosis, which implies medical model and cures and surgery and tablets, that sort of baggage that comes with that word.